Hey everybody, this is Eric alongside Rod, and we are delighted to be joined today by BracketDom or Dominic Lese. He's I guess the number 2 bracketologist is probably the best way to put it. He is the founder and lead bracketologist. The founder and lead bracketologist for bracketometry.com. So he's the number 2 most accurate bracketologist or bracketology service in the country per Bracket Matrix. So I had this question I was asking myself probably a couple weeks ago. I'm like, I know I never really paid attention to how Joe Lunardi, he's obviously the most famous one, ESPN doing all the interviews. How accurate are his predictions? I feel like, he misses a couple here and there. There must be someone who actually like grades this. And so I looked in and sure enough found you. So you're number 2 and they grade you based on how often you get the teams correct and then how close you are to the seeding line. And so you're basically, you had everything right last year, right? I mean, within
every
seed line.
team within one seed line, all 60 out of 68, even Texas A&M out, the big controversial one I had. So
right. And so we want to have you on because you're going to be, much more accurate, and it makes me feel more comfortable knowing what the seeding is and sort of the situation and things. So you're also a contributor to Primetime Sports Network, a voter for the Rockin' 25 poll. And just to give a comparison, when you look at the rankings, Joe Lunardi comes in at number 88. Jerry Palm, who's over at CBS, who I've always felt is not very good. He's 125th. Andy Katz, who you see at Big Ten Network oftentimes, he's ranked number 98th. Bracketville, you've seen that sometimes, he's number 70. So we got number 2. So anyway, that's
I want to just offer one word of defense for Andy Katz. Andy Katz, I don't think, is putting himself forward as a bracketologist. He's doing it, but that's not his primary function. Some of these other guys, that's where I think they're due a little more heat.
I don't want to harp on fellow bracketologists too much, but when that's your job that you're paid for, and I'm doing this as a hobby, and I'm number 2, and you're number
right.
150 something. That's all I'm saying.
Well, and it's not as if we're talking about a one-year fluke with the biggest names, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been aware. Eric said he just really looked at it fairly recently. I've been interested in this stuff for quite a number of years. So I've been well aware of the fact that the biggest names are mediocre to bad pretty much always. And so I guess, well, Eric, I'll let you start, and then we're going to get into what kind of tools you use, but we'll get into that in a second.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. So for those of you watching video, welcome to the Final Fours on the Schedule, or Michigan State basketball podcast. For those of you listening on audio, obviously you know what show you've selected, so you know exactly your home where you belong. And to all supporters who support us financially through one-time gifts or through monthly donations through Patreon, thank you so much. This is the sort of extra content we like providing for you guys because, it's of interest to me and to Rod, but also to all of you, I know, because it is March and this is, Michigan State's time of the year. We're very used to this sort of thing because this will be probably the 25th. Was it 25th straight time that Michigan State will be in? And because we missed one year because of COVID. And so that would have been probably 26 since Michigan State, played well at the Big Ten tournament. All right. So the first question I had for you really is a bracketology. I mean, it's not a real thing, right? Like no one goes to school to be a bracketologist. It's a made up thing.
I wish
right?
I would have if I could have. Yeah.
So how did you end up getting into this? I mean, you're obviously really good at it. So, I mean, you don't take classes. So how did you decide to do this?
I think it kind of ties back to what you guys said originally with just how a lot of those top guys really are just not great at it. I mean, all the years, like I was following college basketball as a big fan. I was looking at like Lunardi's bracketology, trusting it. And then every year the bracket would come out and like, why was I taking this as gospel? This was so off of what it was. So every year I started kind of looking at it more and was like, all right, well, if this isn't going to be accurate, let me see what I think teams would be at. Let me look at what the committee looks at. And then just starting to really get into it. And eventually I was like, oh, well, I mean, if I'm trying to just figure it out myself, why don't I just actually do this myself? All the guys I've been following and trying to figure out where teams are seem to be off. I think I could do a better job. And then I was hooked after doing it for 1 year. So
and it is again shocking that you have someone who, well, and I think it's a little bit like we make predictions before the season of where the Big Ten standings are going to be 1 through 14. And, it's easy to not ever go back and say, how good were we? Were we close? Were we far off? And so
I usually prefer, well, yeah, and that's a problem. But
Now, to
yeah,
be fair, if I tried to get into the prediction business before season, like I
Right.
preseason bracketology too, and I'm sure that was terrible. But as far as projecting where teams are based on what they've actually done, I think I'm all right. So
can I ask you a related question, I guess, to this before we get into the actual
yeah.
inputs you're using? At what point in the season do you actually start working on this?
No, that's a great question because I'll release probably in the first few months of the season a bracketology per month, but it's not fully based on what teams have done. I mean, if you try to do a bracketology purely based on results after each team's played 5 games, you're going to have teams in
Right.
wild spots that you know they're not going to end up at. So probably the first 1 or 2 I do before the new year starts, really before January, or kind of more like projection / what have you done so far. And then really once the new year hits, once it's January after the holiday season, that's when I'm really just basing it off of what teams have done, where they would be now if the season finished, and things like that.
Okay. And that's, I can't recall, but it seems to me like it's kind of like Christmas and Halloween. Every year, it seems ESPN is earlier and earlier with their bracketology, to the point that I think they do a bracketology now shortly after the regular season ends for the next year. If I remember correctly,
the day after the championship game. Yeah.
Yeah.
which
is just insane. Yeah.
Well, I get it. They need to get their clicks, but
yeah, but at some point, does accuracy or actually offering insight matter or not? So I guess then turning to how you do what you do, you mentioned that you were kind of brought into this as a result of seeing how others who had high profile weren't particularly accurate, and you figured, okay, I think I can build a better mousetrap here. So what do you use? And I'm not asking you to give away the store here, obviously, but what do you use? What do you use to determine both the field and seeding? So we know the general tools. Net, which has replaced RPI in recent seasons, is obviously a big one. The committee always talks about quality wins and bad losses in terms of quad 1, quad 2, quad 3, quad 4. Is that it? Are there other tools you use in particular? And then, what kind of weighting, again, without giving away too much, I don't want to ask you to do that, but what kind of weighting do you apply to those various tools?
No, for sure. I love being totally transparent with the process. I mean, the committee goes out there and they tell us what they use, and it's just kind of our job to put the pieces of the puzzle together and try to see it through their eyes and how they'll analyze the data. But I mean, the first thing you said, the net, in a way, is the most important and the least important thing. And in sense of your actual net ranking really doesn't matter. I mean, a team with a net of 80 could make it where a team with a net of 35 could be out. What they
didn't we, not to interrupt you, but didn't we see that last year? I believe Rutgers was maybe 77th.
Yes, Rutgers 77 or 78. Yeah, and really all that's hurting isn't Rutgers, it's hurting the teams that beat Rutgers, because they really use the net more for evaluating wins, like you would reference to the quad 1, quad 2, quad 3, quad 4. That's really the only thing the net is in place for, to kind of group your wins. So you can say, like, all right, a team has this record in quad 1, this record in quad 2, this record in quad 3, and this record in quad 4, and they use the net to group those based on like what the net of that team that you beat was. Now, of course, it's the net that team has at this current time. So that's always something that gets a little tricky too. I mean, you could get a quad 2 win, and then that team that you beat at the time was a quad 2 win. They go on a run. Suddenly that bumps up to a quad 1 win. Like North Carolina, for example, is rooting really hard for Michigan to get into the top 50. That can be a quad 1 win, which they desperately need.
We have seen that with Michigan State over the last week or so. They've been bouncing back and forth between 7 and 8 quad 1 wins. as
Yeah.
teams kind of slipped in and out. So yeah, I'm familiar with that phenomenon. Makes sense.
For sure. And then, I mean, on the same, in the same vein, also, it's not just, is it quad one or is it quad two? I think people, like you said, it's kind of slipping in between the two, but the committee will look at that as well. And I think that's one thing a lot of bracketologists do kind of overlook. They just kind of look at it as it's a quad one win or it's a quad two win. But if it's a quad one win that's one spot away from quad two, that's obviously not being evaluated at the same level of good winness. I don't know, a better term for that is it's beating
Right,
the number
right.
one net team on the road, obviously. So you gotta, and even on the committee's team sheets, they have quad one separated into quad 1A and quad 1B, and quad
Okay.
two separated into quad 1A, or sorry, quad 2A and quad 2B. So
Right. So
is
it cuts the other way as well, then, is what you're saying, that if you have a quad two win that was right on the borderline of being a quad one, that's going to be probably more helpful to you in some sense than something that was a win over a team that's much deeper on the quad two list.
Absolutely. I mean, the same goes for like evaluating bad wins. Like, so something like, oh, they have a quad 3 loss. But if it's a quad 3 loss to the number 76 net team at home, I mean, that's one away from a quad 2. The committee is going to look at that and understand that and not punish them enough to where if it was an almost quad 4 loss in the quad 3.
Right. So what else besides, you say, it sounds to me like you say net is really most properly understood as a sorting mechanism.
Correct.
Rather than, hey, number 35 is clearly better than number 50. What else besides net are you looking at?
And then really it's the metrics, but people think metrics are all lumped into just like the metrics. They really kind of separate into two different types of metrics. There's result-based metrics and then predictive metrics.
Sure.
Yeah, and the result-based metrics, that's KPI, that's strength of record, and those are kind of more similar to the old RPI, really just evaluating just who you beat, where, how tough your schedule was compared to what your record is, where the predictive metrics are taking a lot more into consideration. Yeah, KenPom, Sagarin, BPI, those are taking a lot more into consideration, like how efficient are you? How much are you beating these teams by? And those are kind of more used for seeding more than selection, which I think also people don't realize. Like if your predictive metrics are really bad, but you've pulled out a bunch of really tight wins that you had no business winning, they're not going to not put you in because, oh, this team got lucky. No, you still got those wins. That's going to show up in the results-based metrics. You're going to end up in the field. But on the flip side, if you're a team that's probably has just looking at who they beat, who they lost to, oh, that's a 7 seed for sure. But then you look at their predictive metrics and you realize, oh, this team is probably overachieved. They are going to seed you lower because of that. But they aren't going to necessarily keep a team out of the field for that. It's kind of more the predictive metrics weighing heavier on seeding of teams that are in, and those result-based metrics weighing heavier around the bubble.
Okay.
Interesting. Yeah. Well,
anything else that you look at besides those systems?
I mean, like I said, it's really just several of the metrics. I kind of, in my spreadsheet that I use, I have a few result-based metrics that they weigh heavy on, and I kind of have a system that averages them together. So like this is their average result-based metric, and this is their average in the predictive metrics. That way I'm not trying to look at 5 at once and remember what they all were. And like, yeah, as well as just also the wins, the quad 1, quad 2, quad 3, quad 4 wins and losses. And on that, quad 4 losses are very harmful historically. And we got a few teams this year with good resumes that have a few. I'm going to be really interested to see how teams like A&M and Clemson fare, because that could be some good data for the future.
There's also one close to us that is having their fortunately is having their resume dragged down by a quad 4 loss to Central Michigan. So I know what you're talking about. Well, the last question on this point I wanted to ask you is, there's always, and we may have another test of it this year, this concept. There is a sense that if you've got a close call and it involves a so-called blue blood, or at the very least, let's say with Michigan State, where they don't qualify as the bluest of blue bloods, but they're an elite program historically. So even somebody in that range, say in the 6 to 15 range in terms of all time, perception wise, that those programs will get the benefit of the doubt. And there's lots of supposed reasons for this. If you get into conspiracy type thinking that, well, the committee wants to make sure that these programs with big followings are part of it for the ratings, that they just get the benefit of the doubt because the rich get richer. Do you think that happens? Do you think that's real?
Way. I'm giving the committee the benefit of the doubt to where I don't think they do that intentionally. Okay. Now, at the same time, I think there can be a little bit of confirmation bias there, where if the bubble's really close on the cut line between Kentucky, and I'm just throwing out random teams, like say Kentucky and Wyoming, were right neck and neck for the last spot in the field. Their resumes were almost identical in every single way. In the back of their heads, they're going to think the answer has to be Kentucky. And then they're going to start nitpicking in the metrics and kind of finding the ones that do favor Kentucky. And I don't know if they're doing that intentionally. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say they don't, because historically they haven't always. I mean, there have been blue bloods left out. There have been some random majors that have made it. One year, Tulsa made it with no right being in there. So, I mean, if they really hated mid-majors, that would have never happened. But I do think when it's close, they're not doing it on purpose. But if it really is a coin flip, I'm gonna push in the blue blood as well if I can't decide, because I think that confidence bias is going to be in their heads.
So you would say you don't believe in the years. And how long have you been doing this, by the way? I don't think we asked that.
This is my, I believe, 5th year doing it like officially, where I've had a website, I've been running the Twitter, I've been on the Bracket Matrix. And like I said, kind of probably more made like 8 years ago. Once I started realizing, like, man, I've been following bracketology for years, and then it's not accurate. I was kind of doing it myself just to kind of test myself, like, maybe I'm better at this. Maybe I can beat Lenardi, and maybe I can beat Jerry Palm. And I did it a couple years myself, and I was comparing my results. It's like, I actually am doing kind of well. Let's try to market this a little bit more. Let's try to make this thing.
So in that time, you don't feel like you've seen enough evidence to feel like there's a definitive power program bias. It's just that it may get in there kind of unconsciously in the minds of the committee, and that can lead to those results occasionally. I mean, it sure looks like we might have an instance of that coming up with, at the very least, with North Carolina.
Yes.
I mean, they look like they're going to be a great test of this.
Yeah, I don't think I mean, if anything, the bias towards the power conferences just kind of comes with how the committee has said they evaluate teams. I mean, just the amount of weight they put on volume of quad 1 wins.
And
the fact that those power conference teams get so many more chances at it. I mean, you'll see a team that goes 3-10 in Q1, but it's like, oh, they have 3 Q1 wins. I mean, some of those mid-majors that had 2 chances at it all year and went 1-1, I think they would have gotten 3 out of 13 as well, but they just don't get those opportunities to. I think that's where the quote unquote bias is, but they're evaluating it the way they say they will analytically. It's just the way they say they will analytically does give an edge towards those teams.
Sure. I've always been of the opinion that, Michigan State, as you may know, typically plays a very challenging non-conference, and usually a few losses come along with that. And invariably, it's people have the memory of goldfish. They every year, like clockwork, people get worked up about this. And my philosophy has always been, hey, if Michigan State takes care of business in the Big Ten, it all works itself out. So there's no reason to get that exercised usually about a non-conference performance if you're a member of the Big Ten and you believe that your team is good enough to do a good job in the Big Ten, because there are ample opportunities pretty much, well, in a normal year, let's say 80% of the conference games you play, are going to be reasonably highly rated opponents.
Yeah.
So, you know, the
I mean, I think
opportunities
it
are always there.
also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it.
Oh, I think also, I mean, it benefits you guys playing that non-conference strength of schedule, because
For sure.
really the only times you see teams in power conferences really hurt by their out of conference is when they played bad teams out of conference and they lost to them. And if all you do is play mostly good teams out of conference, sure, you lose a few, but in the long run, a couple of quadrant 1, quadrant 2 losses out of conference isn't going to kill you in the long run. You play a cupcake schedule out of conference, you play only quad 3 and quad 4 games, and you lose 2 or 3 of those. The overall 11-2 record might be nice, but you have no wins of note and you have 2 bad losses already. Now you're kind of digging yourself a hole. So
absolutely. And I think that's also too, that's the challenging part, or so I've seen it said by Michigan State. We're fortunate to have, you mentioned KPI. I believe that's Kevin's system. Yeah. And he's one of those guys that's considered an expert in scheduling. And I believe I've heard him say, and I've certainly heard other figures in the game talk about how difficult it is to schedule, because when you get into those so-called bye games in November and December, you might not have a really good sense at the time you make that schedule. Well, is this going to be a team that maybe slots into a decent range in terms of where they sit in the metric systems, or are they going to be a Central Michigan where, you know, where it's god awful? And that's a really tough trick to turn. And so maybe the only way you get around that is you just don't schedule many of those games at all.
For sure, because you could schedule a team like, I mean, they schedule these games so far in advance now too. You could schedule Central Michigan in a year that they're second place in the MAC, 70th in the net, and like, oh, that'll be a fun out of conference test. 4 years later, you play them, they're terrible. It's a Q4 game and you lose to them and it tanks your entire resume.
Right.
Agreed. I would say, I mean, even if you want to play a few bye games, play some of those perennial mid-majors that are good every single year, to where even if you lose to them, it's only going to be a quad 3 loss, which doesn't nearly tank you as much as quad 4. I think people realize how much the difference at a Q4 loss. I mean, you can almost say is like 3 quad 3 losses. They really are detrimental.
Yeah,
sure. So I want to just recognize one of our sponsors is Nudge Printing. You can go to nudgeprinting.com. You can pick up some great Spartan apparel. We just mentioned last show, they've printed over 15,000 shirts for Spartan Strong, which helps support the shooting victims from the Spartan tragedy on the 13th and Michigan State's campus. So Gabe and Brittany are both Michigan State alums. They're great people. It's Michigan based in Portland, Michigan, all high quality shirts and products, the screen printing. Check them out. And you can get other schools as well. In fact, this may be somewhat interest to Dom here. They have Texas State available. So if you want to get Texas State t-shirts, sweatshirts, or something like that, you can certainly go to nudgeprinting.com. And for listeners of the show, you can get 20% off by typing in the Final Four into the coupon code, and you can pick up your gear today. So the question on the mind of everyone, you know, there are people on the message board say, hey, make sure you ask about Michigan State. I'm like, don't worry. We are Michigan State basketball podcast. We will absolutely ask about Michigan State seeding. So Michigan State lost, you know, heartbreaker, and Iowa State, just totally ridiculous game.
Yeah.
They've, as we mentioned, they've had a tough non-conference schedule and playing about 500 ball in Michigan in the Big Ten, but has not even been able to play Minnesota, the worst team in the Big Ten, and they actually won't play them because it got canceled. But where do you see them right now in the seeding? I mean, we assume they're in the field. We assume that it'd take a disaster from not to make the field at this point. And then, you know, where do you see them sort of, you know, the ceiling and the floor maybe for the season, assuming they don't make a run all the way through the Big Ten tournament, which case, you know, it's hard to predict that.
Yeah, for sure. No, right now, at least before this weekend, I had them as one of the lower 7 seeds, and a loss at Iowa in overtime in that heartbreaking fashion, that could have bumped you guys up, but it's really not going to lower them that much either. I think people always want to overreact to losses and say like, oh, well, they're going down a seed line now. Now you lose a game like that, it's more you missed an opportunity to go up. So they're probably still sitting there around like the bottom of the 7 line. maybe an 8, depending on just, I'm doing another scrub new bracket tomorrow, just depending on how much some other teams kind of rose above them, how their metrics went up, but still pretty solidly in that 7 to 8 range. And I'd have a hard time at the end of the regular season, at least, even seeing them out of that area. I mean, their last 2 games, both Q2 games, and right now they have a 4-1 Q2 record. I mean, assuming they don't lose both of those, that going to 6-1 or that going to 5-2 at this point of the season with so much data really doesn't change much. So I would say they're kind of pretty solidly in that 7 to 8 range. If they win both, probably at least a 7. If they split them, maybe closer to an 8. And again, it could be higher if a bunch of other teams in that range have some bad losses, or vice versa. A bunch of teams below them start picking up amazing wins in the last couple of games. But I feel pretty good with them saying like at a 7 or 8. But like you said, as far as their ceiling goes, and if they, let's not say win the Big Ten tournament, but maybe they go on a run and make the semifinal, the final, I think a 6 at least would be reasonable. I would say they would probably have a resume even better than that, of like maybe even a 5 seed. But as we saw last year with A&M, and we've seen historically, conference tournament runs really don't impact you as positively as they should. And I think that's because as the conference tournaments are getting underway, the committee's already met. They've kind of already talked about their general idea of where teams are. So in general, when you look at these brackets, you don't want to look at in terms of a team moving up or down with a loss. You want to look at it just like, all right, looking fresh. What is this resume compared to this resume? Except for conference tournaments, because then the committee has already done that. And now they're kind of in the mode of just shifting teams where they might not jump up or move down as much as they should based on those conference tournament results. So
that brings to mind a really quick question on that point I wanted to bring up, because this is something that in Big Ten country we hear every single year. Because the Big Ten tournament is, I believe, is always the last one played before the bracket is announced. There has, for many years now, been a belief that it really doesn't matter what happens in that game. That if you win it and you win the Big Ten tournament, you don't get the bump that maybe a winner of a conference tournament. I think the ACC's is usually on Saturday, if I remember correctly, for example. Have you seen anything in the time you've been doing that to lend any credence to that? Or do you think it's basically just conference tournaments in terms of who wins them really doesn't matter all that much in terms of the impact on seeding, regardless of whether you're playing on Friday or Saturday or Sunday?
I would say, I mean, I almost try to completely disregard even the Saturday results, because I think the committee is trying to get it finalized by then. But to your point, I do think the closer it gets to the actual selection show, the even less impact it has. So even those Saturday conference tournament games, I don't think are having the impact that they should. But the Big Ten being on Sunday probably is even having less of an impact, because they have to have that bracket out 30 minutes later. Really, the only time I would say that game really is going to affect your seeding is if those two teams are like right next to each other, almost fighting for like say they go into it like, all right, these are the 8 and 9 on our seed list. They might say, okay, winner, let's have two conditional brackets. Winner of this game gets the 3, loser gets the 2. But on the flip side, you get a surprise run by someone like Michigan or Michigan State makes all the way to the final against Purdue. I don't think that's going to affect Purdue's seed win or loss or whoever makes it to the final, unless it's a team that was on the bubble and maybe wouldn't make it unless they actually won it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that, slotting phenomenon. I could think of there was a year in the 2012 final where Michigan State played Ohio State for the title, and it seemed pretty obvious, and it did turn out this way. Whoever won the championship was going to get the 1, and whoever lost it was going to get a 2 seed. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, I remember that. And I think you're spot on. But yeah, if they had been further apart in the seed list, might not have mattered at all.
Okay. So I think we've got a pretty good sense of how you see Michigan State. It looks like a 7 or 8 is most realistic. maybe an upside if they really do some good work over the next 2 weeks, sneaking into a 6, but that's kind of the range. Where
then
do you?
I mean, I guess I would
Yeah,
say if they lost
right.
both
All
games,
three. Yeah.
and then had a bad loss in the first round of the tournament, picked up 3 more losses down the stretch, maybe then we probably would see them as the road team, quote unquote, in the first game as like a 9, maybe even as low as a 10. But even if they did that, they're gonna be in the field. 10 would be the absolute worst if they lost their last 3 games. I think you can safely say they're a lock in the field at this point.
That's how
Great.
I've seen it, but I think that's going to make a lot of listeners breathe easy. Not that I expect them to test that, but you never know.
Now, don't come screaming at me when they lose out. And the teams all pull out these amazing victories, but
we're going to be looking at your bracket.
I feel good calling them a lock. Yes.
So we've got a sense of how you see MSU. Turning more in a broader scope to the Big Ten as a whole, where do you see the Big Ten as a league relative to other leagues nationally? And the sense I've gotten is that they're generally viewed as the second best league behind the Big 12. Is that how you see it?
I think I would definitely agree with that. I think there's a much bigger gap this year than other years. I think the Big 12 is definitely far and away the best conference in basketball this year. I mean, all 10 of those teams, I think if they were in any other conference, would probably be tournament teams. It's ridiculous how stacked they are this year, but I do feel pretty good saying they're the second, if not at the very worst, the third. The SEC's maybe kind of right there, but I think you guys are just a lot deeper. So I would feel comfortable calling you guys the second best conference, but maybe closer to third this year to the SEC than to first with how good the Big 12 has been, but second feels like an accurate ranking for sure.
And so then the first question always the first question is, how's Michigan State seed line look? And the second question is always the team that lives rent free in our minds that we can't help. University of Michigan, they made the last 2 Sweet 16s, which I think is more than anything irritating our fan base so much because they've had a little bit of success in the tournament, unexpected both times. And Michigan State, it's been 3 years since we've been to the Final Four. It's been forever. So, it's
for
really,
you guys, that's forever.
I can barely remember that far.
It's
hardly worth watching them anymore because they barely make the Final Four. So Michigan, they're playing really well right now. I think there's any question about that. They're playing much better than they were earlier in the season. They had some, bad losses. Where does Michigan sit? What does Michigan have to do to get in the field? Or the opposite of that be is, what do they have to do so that we don't have to worry about them being in the field? That's really what we want to know.
At this point, it's funny. I actually have them out right now, but I'm having a hard time seeing how I keep them out down the stretch. Unless they lose out. Their last 2 games are both road Q1A games. I mean, not just quadruple one. Like I said, they split them 2 road Q1, top of Q1 games. And given where their resume is now, if they just get one of those 2 and losing the other isn't going to hurt them, I think that's going to be enough to elevate them, at least from where I have them in the first 4 out to at least the first 4 in, and then barring any bad loss in the first round of the conference tournament. And I would say split those last 2 games and win their first conference tournament game, they're probably in. So if you guys don't want to worry about Michigan, I think they need to lose their last 2. Now, at the same time, like I said, they're 2 really difficult games that they have. So could they lose both of those? 100%. Sure. And then at that point, they would probably need to make a deep conference tournament run to even be in consideration. But
that was going to be my next question. So let's assume, and we're not going to hold you to this, obviously, but just talking here, let's assume that they lose at Illinois and at Indiana to end the season.
Yes.
And they go into the Big Ten tournament. In that scenario, do you think 2 Big Ten tournament wins would be enough, or you think it would be 3? And I guess it also depends on who they're playing, right?
Yeah, that's what 2 things is what makes it tough. 1, who they're playing, and then 2, it's just the committee is always so inconsistent on how they evaluate, like I said, conference tournament runs. Now, I think what would help them is that where teams really don't get the benefit of like the credit of those games, or like in those later Friday, Saturday, Sunday games.
Right.
So What day? Remind me. The Big Ten tournament starts on a
Wednesday.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, theoretically, they could get at least like, even if they started on Thursday, 2 solid wins before the Saturday game that might not have as much of an impact. So I would say, yeah, they would need to get at least 2 and then just pray that the committee is still watching and evaluating on Friday and Saturday when they're playing those good games. But I might still keep them out. I mean, last year I did the same thing with A&M. They were on the bubble, won a bunch of games, got to the SEC tournament final, and was like, I think they're already set. I didn't have them close to in now. I don't care how much that helped their resume. I think you got to keep them out. And a lot of bracketologists didn't. I did. And that's what helped me get towards the top last year. So maybe Michigan will do the same thing for me this year. Lose their next 2, go on a deep tournament run. I'll keep them out and get some more points.
All right.
So you guys happy, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh yeah. No, we're looking for 2 losses for sure to really put the heat on. But I think that's what's such a difficult thing about it this year is normally you have much more well-defined tiers in the Big Ten. As I'm sure you're aware, this year it's a mess. And the one thing we had been saying, which is, well, it's Purdue, a couple of teams at the bottom who are awful, and then everybody else in a giant middle class. But now even Purdue's been coming back to the pack. So I think trying to predict who you're going to, and the scenarios for what seeds people are going, different teams are going to have in this thing are endless. I've never seen it like this because you're going to get into tiebreakers and you don't know who you might be in a tiebreaker against at this point. I mean, it's just really difficult to discern what that path is even going to look like for Michigan right now, who they'd have to play.
Yeah, it's so jumbled. We can't, it's not gonna be like, oh, they'll have to beat this team in the first, I mean, literally they could play any endless combination of teams. So it's going to be a lot clearer once the conference tournament bracket is set for sure. But until then, like you said, it's who knows. It's like that across all of college basketball this year, in terms of conference standings, seedings. This has been one of the more years full of parity than I can remember. I mean, I feel like that sounds cliche. I feel like people say that every year, but this year especially, it's true.
No, this is something we've spent a lot of time talking about, that it's true, not just in the Big Ten, but when I look nationally, you do not have the kind of elite teams at the top that we're used to seeing. And then there's even that next group of teams after that seems much smaller than normal. It just seems to me like it's a year where everybody's got real flaws. And so, I mean, you obviously, you know, what you're doing is trying to pick this field and slot teams into the appropriate seeds, which is, I gather at the end of the day, it's simply an evaluation of the work that people have done to this point. But the next step to it, with people who enter their bracket pools and try to predict how this stuff is going to go, I don't know how anybody is going to make sense of this thing, because it's,
I don't think I'm going to either. I'm never
Yeah.
good at actually filling out the brackets as much as I am predicting what they will look like. I mean, I'm usually towards the upper end of bracket pools. I mean, I know what I'm doing, but I'm not number 2 in every bracket pool. I'll put it that way.
You're always losing to Marge, who's just picks based on mascots, right? In the office, right? Yeah. So then I guess the next question is, the rest of the Big Ten field. My wife's a huge Hawkeyes fan. Iowa, how does Iowa stack up? And then, which teams, I guess, go from top to bottom, the teams that are in, the teams that are not in, sort of what the few teams that are on the bubble, or you maybe have a remote chance of getting, like, let's say Penn State or,
For sure.
Wisconsin are the teams probably near the bottom.
I got to ask, did you watch the Michigan State game with your wife? How was that at the end?
We have to do this. We have to do this twice a year, Dom. We have to football game too sometimes. And so it's, it's something we just kind of work our way through. She's always very upbeat. She's like, well, someone's going to be happy. I'm like, yeah, that also means someone's gonna be sad. And so I was feeling great that game.
I was going to say, and you were the happy one for about 39 minutes.
That was the, most bizarre ending, obviously. I mean, that was the 1 in 10,000 or 1 in a million or something ending. But yeah, so we get through it fine. We stay married, so it's been okay for us. But she's not a crazy fanatical fan, like where she just goes, she doesn't have unrealistic expectations of her team, which Rod points out a lot of times other fan bases might have within the Big Ten.
Yeah.
If you guys are still married after that game, then I think it's a rock solid marriage. But no, I'll answer your question. As far as, I mean, obviously Purdue in the mix for a 1 seed. I lock. I mean, the next few teams I'll go in order. I think Indiana's really starting to make a strong push here. They're probably going to be a top 4 seed at this point. And obviously they were the preseason favorite. And for a while I was kind of wondering why. And now I think we're starting to see it. Northwestern, despite that loss to Maryland, is still in very good shape. They're probably going to be somewhere probably similar to Michigan State, maybe slightly above still, kind of like in that 6 to 7 instead of 7 to 8 seed range.
Right.
Illinois probably before that Ohio State loss, I would have said similar as well, but they're probably kind of right there with Michigan State now, probably projected as about a 7. Obviously Maryland, by beating Northwestern, gave themselves a nice little bump. I had them as a 7. I want to move them up to a 6, but they've still beaten absolutely no one on the road, which the committee does usually punish teams for. So might still have them in that 7 area, even though as a whole, their resume is probably a little better than that. Just that's a pretty glaring flaw that the committee loves to punish, not beating anyone on the road. Iowa, like you said, maybe would have been in a little trouble had they not picked up that win versus Michigan State, but now I think they're very solidly in, probably even as a single-digit seed at this point. So that was a pretty crucial comeback for them. Then after that, I would go towards the teams that maybe are in the bubble a little bit. Well, the first one would have been on the bubble had they not pulled off an absolutely ridiculous comeback last night by 19
Rutgers
on the road. Yes.
Yeah.
I was ready to, I had their memoriam all typed up. I was going to say how Rutgers had been collapsing. They were trending towards out, but pulling out that win, man, that's a good win that actually elevates them too. So I might probably even still have them in that 9 seed range. Obviously still not 100% safe, but maybe they're about 1 win away at this point to where they could have been a lot more trouble otherwise. Beyond that, now we're truly on the bubble. Wisconsin, Michigan, Penn State are probably the 3 that really could go either way. Rutgers safer end of the bubble, but those 3 coin flips, maybe Penn State not so much now. I think, hell, I mean, I'm going to look at their resume again tonight. I haven't since yesterday. Had they won that Rutgers game, I would have maybe even slotted them into the field, but there's so few opportunities left at this point of the season. Even though I'm still probably going to have them close, by dropping the ball in that one, I don't know if they have enough opportunities left to get themselves back in, even if they end up in that first 4 out area. And then the other 2 are the ones that are literally right on the cut line. I had Michigan as my 5th team out and Wisconsin as my 2nd to last team in. And that was before Michigan beat Wisconsin after that ridiculous game tying 3 to force overtime. So now it might be literally as close as Wisconsin might be the last team in, Michigan might be the first team out. I mean, they are right there neck and neck, and head-to-head isn't usually a factor, but sometimes when it's super close, the committee will look at it. So that Michigan over Wisconsin win could be one we go back and look at and realize that's the reason Michigan made it over Wisconsin. I think good chance one of those 2 probably go in. So obviously big when one beats the other.
Sure.
Kind of related to this discussion every year, particularly as we head into the week after this one, next week, where you have the major conference tournaments playing, but also sometimes the mid majors, this concept of a bid stealer, where somebody you don't see who wouldn't have gotten into the field otherwise goes out and wins a conference tournament, and how that can affect how many spots are available on the right side of the bubble. Obviously the major conferences, we don't have to talk about it because we know that stuff is unlikely, but it could happen. Do you see are there obvious scenarios? Like I think about teams like Florida Atlantic or Charleston, maybe, where if those teams don't win their conference tournament, you think they're still likely to be in the field, and that could end up bumping off one of these Wisconsins or Michigans that we're talking about.
I think you hit the nail on the head with Florida Atlantic. I think the Conference USA is by far the most likely route for a bid stealer this year. I mean, they're probably still in unless they lose maybe in the first round of the Conference USA tournament and pick up a really bad loss there. The committee does seem to, like I said, that confirmation bias count against losses for mid-majors and conference tournaments, maybe more than those power conference teams. But as long as they don't lose to a really bad team in it, I think they're going to be safely in. And the Conference USA is stacked. I mean, you got North Texas, UAB with Jelly Walker, a star. I mean, any of those teams could win it. And if any of you that's not FAU, that is bad news for all of those teams on the bubble. I mean, like I said, if say I had Wisconsin as the last team in, Michigan as the first team out, suddenly there's a bid stealer out of CUSA, boom, that bumps them down. They're both out now. I mean,
right. And what about Charleston? Do you see them in that same category or not as much?
Not as much. I don't think it's impossible, but again, their conference isn't nearly as good to the point where if they did lose in their conference tournament, that loss probably would be enough to keep them out. Meanwhile, Conference USA has some good teams. I mean, UAB, as long as they, FAU, as long as they make the semifinals of the Conference USA tournament, whoever they're losing to there really probably isn't going to hurt them that much.
Right.
Charleston, they lose in the Colonial, and whoever they lose to there, that's going to be a bad loss. And I would probably have them close-ish to the bubble right now, but if they have one more bad loss, that probably pretty much eliminates them completely. And there's no way they don't win there's no way they would be in the at-large mix if they didn't lose another game, because then they would just get the AQ at that point.
Well, interesting, because they were a team that seemed to be getting a lot of that discussion as a potential at-large earlier in the year, but I guess their resume's taken enough hits in the last few weeks to take them.
I mean, teams like that, it really just takes those like couple of losses to send their resume plummeting. I mean, when they only had the one loss and it was to North Carolina, and they're in great shape. Then they pick up 2 losses in a week, and you go from projected 10 seed to not even really anywhere towards the bubble, which is a shame because I think they're a really good team. I think if they played in a better mid-major league like the Conference USA, I think Charleston very well could be in the same position FAU is in right now. But it's just when you're playing that many games and every week, it's just another landmine that can only hurt you and help you. It's just hard to keep that up for so long. And eventually it was due to catch up with them.
Anybody else that you see fitting into this category, or is it really largely Florida Atlantic?
No, I would actually, I mean, you can never write off Villanova. Getting healthy at the right time. I know it's not common to see the bid thieves from those power conference schools.
Well,
Georgetown do it a few years back.
Right. Obviously, I mean, the major conferences, which I would consider the Big East a major conference in basketball terms, certainly. We know we can see some. I mean, Christ, even in the Big Ten, I wouldn't bet money on it, but could Penn State get hot? A team that plays the way they do, they just have 4 days where they can't miss from 3. Could they win the Big Ten tournament? Sure.
Penn State would be an interesting one, though, because if they made the final, at that point, I'm not sure if they would be a bid stealer. Maybe at that point, their resume would be where it would need to be regardless. But at the same time, they don't love factoring in those conference tournaments so much. That would be a tough call. I don't know, but they wouldn't be. They'd be one of those ones that, like, are they a bid stealer or not? Kind of, what was it last year when Virginia Tech won the ACC tournament? Yeah. It turned out, based on where the seed list was, that they were a bid stealer, that had they not won it, they would have been out. But I think, myself included, I thought they were in win or loss. So at the time, I was like, that's not a bid stealer. Turns out it was. That could be similar with Penn State Now, maybe Ohio State, that would be a bid stealer.
I wouldn't
That's hard to-
Illinois, but
I wouldn't waste a lot of thought on the likelihood of that happening, having seen a lot of Ohio State, but I guess you never know. But
Yeah.
anybody else in that mid-major? I mean, when I think about this, I think about, sometimes a team in a league like the WCC, those types of leagues. Is there anybody else sitting there that that you think, or smaller leagues where it's a single bid league typically, or is it really just restricted to the teams that we've discussed in your mind? You don't see anybody else that fits into that bid stealing category?
I mean, theoretically, if someone outside of St. Mary's Gonzaga won the WCC, they would 100% be a bid stealer.
Right.
And St. Mary's and Gonzaga are locks at this point, and no one else is close to the bubble. But there's a reason those two are locks and no one else is close, because they're just
Right.
so much
Right.
better than everyone else in that conference. I
Right.
mean, maybe BYU, and they've played Gonzaga and St. Mary's tough this year. Maybe Loyola Marymount. They've actually beat both this year, even
Right.
though those seemed like pretty big flukes. But I think when they're really fully focused in a conference tournament setting, I don't see any of those other teams touching Gonzaga or St. Mary's, especially with the way they stagger their conference tournament to where those two basically get buys into the semifinals. And they don't want that to happen. So the only other one, I mean, outside of the power conferences, because I could see maybe the Pac-12 having a bid thief too, but
Sure.
outside of that, the only one I would say maybe even has the slimmest possibilities would be the Summit League with Oral Roberts, because it's a tough one to where they actually have a really good strength of schedule and they're 27-4, but their strength of schedule is good because of the 4 really good out of conference teams they played. And those are their 4 losses. So had they just won one of those, I think they'd be in great shape. Now, I mean, does the committee just say, well, they played a tough schedule and they're 27-4 against it, we can't keep them out? Maybe they look at it and do, but I think they would have had to win one of those games, especially because if they end up in this bid thief discussion, it means now they did lose to someone in conference finally, which would be a bad loss now on their resume to go against no good wins. And at that point, they'd probably be out. I'd say maybe there's a 5% chance that Oral Roberts could still make it with a loss in the final there. But as far as mid-majors go, I think FAU really is our only bet is that, well, maybe the Mountain West, I guess if you count that as a mid-major. A team like New Mexico, who started the year so hot, but now is kind of fallen off and is likely not going to make it. Could they win the Mountain West? Sure. Could San Jose State, who's having a nice resurgent season, win it? Maybe. I think the UNLV, who gets to play it at home, they're not in, but could they be good enough to beat all those teams on their home floor? Sure. So, I mean, I usually don't even consider the Mountain West a mid-major, even though it truly is. So I guess that's the other answer to the question.
Mid-major plus. Mid-major plus.
Yeah. And they're definitely better than Conference USA. I kind of put them more in like the WCC range with Gonzaga and St. Mary's. So definitely could see. But at the same time, they also have so many teams that are going to, I mean, Nevada's going to be in. Boise State's probably going to be in, San Diego State's going to be in. So it's not like there's the one team and everyone else is a bid thief. I mean, someone would have to knock off like all 3 of those teams that are going to get at larges to be a bid thief, but it's definitely possible.
Right.
Great. Well, we have one of our listeners, Hazel Motes, sent us a question. His question was about Izzo, and Izzo, the way he coaches generally, if it's a blowout against a bad team or even a good team that he's, up big, he'll put his reserves in earlier in the game, not try and run up the score, not try and win by 25, 30, 40 points or something. And, somebody, especially the bye games, is that something that hurts his seeding? Is that something that, if with the metrics, is it better for him to just keep the starters in and just, finish the team off by a ton?
I would say in the long run, probably yes, honestly, but not by enough to where I would say, Izzo, you need to change your whole philosophy on it. I mean,
I don't think I'd ever say that.
Yeah, exactly. In the end, if Michigan State ends as the 7 seed, but they blew out a bunch more bad teams and their metrics were a little bit higher because of that, could they have been a 6? Sure. So, I mean, if you really want to tire your starters out that much more game after game to where they have tired legs going into March, just to be one seed line higher. Yeah, but again, I'm kind of in the camp of Izzo, to where we don't need that one extra seed line. We're good in March regardless. Let the metrics fall where they do. And I guess the only time someone could argue to where they should is, oh, well, what if we end up on the bubble? Won't we need those metrics then? But that's again where I said those predictive metrics that those blowouts would help really are only used for seeding and not selection. So to answer the question, yes, it might hurt them by a seed, but I don't think it's worth it. I think what Izzo's doing is fine.
Yeah, and I
He's got a
think
good
that's
track
been the complaint, is that you have these systems that reward margin of victory, and because Michigan State doesn't tend to pour it on, and they tend to play more people anyway in terms of their rotation size, and then particularly in blowouts, they tend to go to that bench, the deep bench, a little earlier. People call it jokingly or derisively Ken Palm time.
Yes.
When you're in the last few minutes of a game and you're trying to keep that margin above 20, let's say. So there've been some complaints about that from some quarters of the fan base, but so it sounds like you think that there is an effect to some small extent in terms of what it might do for your seating, but not a massive one. I wanted to ask you about, there's been one particular team in the Big Ten that has really caught people's attention in terms of how it has sat in these different systems, specifically in net and Ken Palm, since those are the two that I think most people pay the most attention to, and that's Ohio State.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, and I know you're not responsible for these systems by any means, but I'm wondering, as somebody who obviously uses them, has some familiarity with what they're about, how do you explain Ohio State remaining as highly ranked as they were for as long as they were, despite taking loss after loss after loss? And I think I know some of the general answers, but I'm curious how much attention you paid to their particular case, because it's gotten a lot of attention in our world.
For sure. And I mean, I think it's just because they've taken loss after loss after loss, but they've played an insane strength of schedule, and a lot of those losses were close. I mean, those predictive metrics will almost look at like a 2-point loss the same as they'll look like at a 2-point win. Those predictive metrics don't even really care as much if you won or lost. It's just all of those efficiency margins. So, I mean, they lost to Purdue by 2. I mean, they lost to Duke by 9, to Rutgers by 4, to Illinois by 9. Those are all Q1A games that were single digits, that in terms of the metrics, those close losses, it might as well be close wins when you're looking at the predictive metrics. So the fact that they've played almost nothing but just those top 2 quadrant games, and they've really stayed close in a lot of them. I mean, and heck, some of the wins that they do have, they weren't close. I mean, they destroyed Northwestern on the road. They they blew out Iowa at home. I think they blew out Illinois at home. So, I mean, efficiency wise, they've been an all right team. I mean, I think honestly that net ranking is kind of right. I mean, they probably are the 63rd best team ish in the country. They've just had a lot of bad luck in close games, and now they're starting to kind of tail off because now the team's starting to lose belief because they lost a bunch. But I think if they had some better luck in those close games early on and hovered more around 500, I think they'd still be a pretty good team. I think they've just had some bad luck and kind of fallen off the wayside because of it. But I think the predictive metrics are right to still reward you with wins, especially on the road at Ohio State.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting to me is my understanding of the way that those systems function has been that historically over time, margin of victory or closeness of defeat, I guess the other side of the coin, is very closely tailored to, I'll loosely use the term quality. How good a team you are, right? That's the rationale, right? And
100%.
And generally speaking, I have no doubt that that's true. in Ohio State's case, it's been given that, again, we're watching these guys play all the time. And I think people who were actually watching them got to this a lot quicker that, hey, this team's in trouble. They're not that good. They're not as good as the rankings would seem to indicate. They're going to find ways to lose. And that's for a variety of reasons we don't need to waste time on here. But I do think that was the case. I'm certain they're not the first weird outlier case, but it was weird enough to make me wonder, is it just something about this team that kind of broke the system? Because and it doesn't sound like you're convinced of that, which is totally fine. I mean, that's part of why I wanted to bring it up, is to have a healthy discussion about it. But, because again, you mentioned that some of these systems, KenPom being one, is a predictive measure. And, I'm always amazed, I shouldn't be, how closely the KenPom predicted score, the margin of difference between the two teams, is to the opening Vegas line. It's remarkably
100%.
close. Yeah. But that, again, this is predictive stuff. And it was just game after game after game after game. You're seeing Ohio State lose. And again, we talked about it. This was actually a topic of discussion on our podcast, is that for whatever reason, the metric systems are getting it wrong about Ohio State. This was at a point where they had maybe lost 5 or 6 in a row and not, 13 or whatever it got to before they finally won. I don't expect that anybody's going to throw their system out the window and say, we got to start from scratch and fix this. But it because it's been close to home, it's been really interesting to watch, because I don't have, for as long as I've been paying attention to this stuff, I don't have another example in the Big Ten that was much like this, where this team just absolutely broke their system relative to how the systems were viewing them and what the results were ultimately. In terms of wins and losses, as you pointed out, those systems are really much more oriented toward what's the differential going to be. And so I guess if you're looking at it from that perspective, they're maybe not missing as badly. But I can tell you, KenPom had a lot of wins predicted for Ohio State that didn't materialize.
Yeah,
a lot.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it didn't. It's hard to say it broke the system when you look at all of those other predictive metrics and see that they have Ohio State up there too. I mean,
I mean all
71
systems, not just KenPom.
Okay. Oh, fair. Yeah.
because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you know more about this than I do, but they probably assign different weights to different elements to some extent, but by and large, they're all taking into account margin of victory, or the score differentials, right?
100%. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think with the metrics, it really need to start taking into consideration, like you said, if a game is 20 points with 5 minutes to go and it ends at 40, versus if it's 20 with 5 minutes to go and it ends at 12. Both of those games were decided with 5 minutes to go.
Right.
And I think they do some, but I know for sure the metrics don't weigh into considerations like how that final score came to be as much as they should. I mean, two teams could both win by 12, and one of them could have been a 3-point game with a minute left and it got to 12 on late free throws. The other one could have been a 20-point game in garbage time with all the scrubs in, got it back to 12. And the metrics are pretty much evaluating those the exact same way, where should they? No, but it's just kind of hard analytically. I mean, with a formula to take that into consideration.
Sure.
I have sympathy for them, but for exactly that reason, as you say, that starts to almost stray into the realm of subjectivity to me.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a problem when you're trying to do what these various systems are trying to accomplish, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they're supposed to just be completely analytical, but then, and then I'm sure there's some way you could develop a system like, I know Eric Haslam with Haslam Metrics. He has a good metric system that has a analytically final, to where when the game is pretty much decided, his metric system no longer takes the rest of the game in consideration. I mean, if they started adapting something like that, I think that could be helpful. But again, yeah, it's hard to develop a system for that that's completely unsubjective.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Humans are always messing things up.
Yes.
So I'd like to go talk to, again, I'd encourage our listeners. The other sponsor of our show is Brothers That Just Do Gutters. It is springtime in Michigan. Well, we've had ice storms. I don't know what it's like in Texas, but probably not that bad. It's what we've got going on right now. But if you want your gutters fixed, you got water problems, contact the Brothers That Just Do Gutters if you're on the west side of the state, all the way from Rockford down to Saugatuck, out to the Lakeshore and over to Lowell. If you're in that area, talk to Kurt Selford and his buddies. They're going to take good care of you. They do gutter cleaning, repair. They'll do replacements. They have all kinds of selections of different colors and different options, leaf guards, all those sorts of things. The thing you never want to think about are your gutters. So make sure you just get them done right. And so talk to Kurt and his team. You can contact me at kurt.stauffer@brothersgutters.com. You can find the links to that in the show notes for the podcast. If you tell them Final Four, you get 10% off your price. So the next question, it relates back to what happened on campus in Michigan State on February 13th. We had the shooting. 2 days later, we had a basketball game scheduled against Minnesota. I think there's still some Michigan State fans, me included, who are a little salty that Rutgers was unwilling to inconvenience themselves and we're playing on short rest and moving a game, which, okay, they did it, whatever. But from an analytics standpoint and from a seeding, would it have been at all helpful to Michigan State to play the game? I mean, we know that for sure it would probably have some impact on their seeding for the Big Ten tournament. We already kind of talked about as far as this Big Ten goes. I mean, who the hell knows what seeding really makes a difference in the Big Ten tournament? You have no idea of knowing who you're going to play, and you're not going to probably get 2 days rest. Would there any advantage to playing that game, or would it actually probably have hurt the analytics for Michigan State to play Minnesota, who is a historically bad Big Ten team? I mean, I don't even remember the last team that's been that bad in the Big Ten.
No, I mean, I think, like you said, the really only way it's hurting them is in terms of conference seeding, and hopefully the Big Ten kind of steps in and does something. It's similar to what happened with like Buffalo and Kansas City in the NFL, to where since they're not able to make up the game, they'll still kind of reward them to where, assuming they would have won that game or something along those lines. I'm not sure what can be done, but maybe, hopefully they will. But it's whether they do or don't. The conference seeding really is the only way that's hurting them, because playing that game could have absolutely tank them. I mean, like I'm saying, they're pretty much a lock right now. If they still played Minnesota, I probably wouldn't lock them in yet, because a loss to them could be the type of thing to where, oh crap, now that's another really bad loss on the resume. Now we better win one of these other games down the stretch. Pressure's on. So, and also to allude back to earlier, like you said, with Tom Izzo not blowing teams out late, it probably wouldn't have helped the metrics if they went into Minnesota and only won by 9 because they were playing some of the subs late. It probably would have actually lowered the metrics. So I think in all sense and purposes, as far as avoiding a potentially bad loss, even though it probably wouldn't have happened, and the metrics of just not blowing out a bad team, I think it's actually a good thing that you guys aren't playing them, as long as it doesn't prevent you from getting the double bye in the conference tournament.
Right. That's kind of the take I've had. The way I've explained it to people is you can't think about Minnesota this year as a typical last place Big Ten team.
Yeah.
They are much more akin to a bye game opponent you play in November or December. Like that's 100%. How poorly they're regarded by the systems, and so there's no upside and quite a bit of downside from playing them. So I guess
the only thing is maybe if you lost to them, that would help their metrics and make it only Q3, but you still don't want to lose Q3 game either. So
yeah. So it seems to me you're obviously locked into this world. Do you watch a lot of college basketball?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
I'm locked into the numbers just as much as I watch it, but I got my 3 TV setup here behind me to watch as many games as I possibly can at all times.
So is there anybody beyond Texas State that you particularly root for, pay attention to? Are you more of a Big 12 guy in terms of where your attention goes, or
It's really, I
just
mean, it's wide. I mean, I always like to root for the underdogs. I'll root for seasons where team, like you were saying Charleston earlier. I was hoping they would keep winning so that they could
Mhm.
get an at-large. I like to root for fun stories like that. It really just depends on storylines each year. Sometimes, even if it's
gotcha?
our conference team, they'll have a player that I really like just for some random reason in my head. I don't know. I just like, oh, this guy's cool, and then I start rooting for them. So it really varies year to year. I'll definitely find myself rooting for teams, whether it's because I just like who they have that year. I like the coach. Maybe I'm rooting for a game because, if this team wins, it's going to make seeding them easier. But as far as a true fandom, not really. Like I said, I went to Texas State. If we got better, I would definitely get a lot more into our college basketball. I think the year that COVID shut everything down, we actually had a great chance and a good team. So of course, that's the one year we don't get our shot. But
Right.
and then what was it? My mom went to Ohio, and they always do great in the MAC and go on conference runs. So I'll root for them when
Sure.
they're good. My dad
They've
went
had-
to West Virginia, so I mean, I'm rooting for them to make it in on the bubble right now. And I'm not diehard West Virginia by any means, but I'll root for them over other Big 12 teams just for that reason. So,
Sure. That's the same as I am with Drake, because that's my dad's alma mater
oh,
in
there
Missouri
you go.
Valley.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Like if they
hoping
played
that they-
Michigan State, of course you're not rooting for them, but yeah, you got a soft spot in your heart for Drake.
Right, exactly. And I don't even know who well, I do know he'd cheer for Drake over Michigan State if they end up running to each other in the tournament.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
Dom, thanks so much for joining the show. Can you tell us
Absolutely.
where do we find your stuff and I know at BracketDom is your Twitter handle. So if you want to follow you on Twitter to get your updates and things,
Yeah.
and bracketometry.com. Anywhere else that we can follow you or get a hold of
That's
you?
pretty much the main two. No, yeah, just follow me at BracketDom on Twitter. Pretty much after every single game finishes that has any sort of tournament seeding implications, I'll post updates on that. And like I said, on the website Bracketometry, I'll come up with actual full bracket updates at least twice a week. Once March comes, I'm going to start doing that every single day, as I do every single year. And then the link to bracketometry.com, if you don't want to try to spell that, is on my Twitter. So easiest way to find me and get to that is, just at BracketDom on Twitter. Give me a follow if you like it, if you're into college basketball. And you can see all my bracket projections. And of course, where Michigan State is week to week on there.
Right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show for the Final Four is on the schedule. We'd love to probably have you on next week once the Big Ten tournament sort of brackets get set. If you want to stop by, it'd be great to kind of get our idea for where everyone else is in the bubble. Because we got two more games for every team, and so things are going to change quite a bit. So until next time, the Final Four is on the schedule. Go green.